Welcome. I am your host, Dr. Watson. Thank you for joining me on another journey. Today we are talking about the widow of Wexford Hall, but before we start, let me know where you are watching from and what was the first Sherlock Holmes story you ever heard about. Chapter 1, The Brothers' Petition. It was on a bitter afternoon in the third week of January 1895 that I found Sherlock Holmes in one of his darker moods. He had been without a case for nearly a fortnight. His pipe had gone cold in his hand twice without his noticing. 3 newspapers lay scattered at his feet, each discarded with the same expression of contempt. I sat by the fire with a medical journal, pretending to read when the bell rang below. Holmes lifted his head like a hound catching scent. "A client," he said. "Male, middle-aged, prosperous clothing, but not prosperous circumstances. He has been walking in weather he did not dress for, an impulsive visit. And he has frightened Watson. Listen to that tread. A frightened man climbs stairs as though each step might be the last solid ground beneath him." The door opened, and Mrs. Hudson showed in a gentleman who confirmed Holmes's reading in every particular. He was perhaps 50, solidly built, with a florid face and the bearing of professional respectability. His overcoat was of good wool and recent cut, but his shirt cuffs were frayed at the edges, and his boots, though polished, had been resoled more than once. A man who presented well from a distance, but was quietly coming apart at the seams. "Mr. Gerald Hale," said Holmes, before the man had spoken a word. Our visitor stopped short. "How on earth? Your card, which you sent up with Mrs. Hudson, identified you by name. I confess the deduction was not among my more demanding." The faintest smile crossed Holmes's lips. "Please sit down, Mr. Hale. You have come about your brother." Gerald Hale sank into the offered chair as though his legs had been waiting for permission to fail. "Then you have heard—" "I have heard nothing. But you are in mourning. The black band on your arm is new, and your agitation suggests not grief alone, but suspicion. A man who has lost a brother to natural causes grieves. A man who believes his brother was murdered paces the street outside a detective's rooms for 20 minutes before finding the nerve to ring, which, I observe from the mud on your left boot, is precisely what you have done." Hale stared at Holmes for a long moment. Then something in him broke, and the words came tumbling out. "My brother is dead, Mr. Holmes. Sir Edmund Hale of Wexford Hall in Hampshire, found 4 days ago in his study, seated in his armchair by the fire, a book in his lap. The door bolted from the inside, the windows latched, not a mark on him, not a sign of struggle, not a thing out of place. The coroner has ruled cardiac failure and the world has moved on, and I am sitting in your rooms because I know that it was murder." Holmes leaned forward. The lethargy of the past fortnight vanished from him as completely as morning fog before a hard wind. "On what grounds?" "I cannot say precisely. That is why I have come to you. You suspect, but you cannot specify. You feel, but you cannot prove. These are poor foundations, Mr. Hale. My brother was 58 years old and strong as a draught horse. He rode every day, drank moderately, kept early hours. His physician had not treated him for anything more serious than a cold in 3 years. And yet, I am to believe his heart simply stopped one January evening while he read by the fire. Hearts do stop, Mr. Hale. It is, in fact, the one thing they are all destined to do. Not Edmund's, not like that, not so." He searched for the word. "Not so conveniently." That word landed in the room with a weight that silenced us both. Holmes's grey eyes narrowed. "Conveniently for whom?" Hale hesitated. I watched his hands tighten on the arm of the chair, and I saw in that hesitation a man standing at the edge of an accusation he was not yet ready to make. "There are circumstances," he said carefully. "My brother's household, his wife, his finances. I do not wish to say more than I know, Mr. Holmes. But something is wrong at Wexford Hall. Something has been wrong there for some time. And now my brother is dead in a room locked from the inside, with no wound, no poison, and no explanation, and I cannot sleep for the wrongness of it. Holmes was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very precisely, "Tell me about the room." Hale described the study, a ground-floor chamber converted from an old stone wine cellar, with walls 3 feet thick and a single casement window overlooking the east garden. One door, fitted with a heavy interior bolt that Sir Edmund threw every evening. A fireplace as the sole heat source. On the morning the body was discovered, the fire had burned to cold ash, and the room was, in Hale's words, like a tomb. The physician, a Dr. Marsh, was called at 7:30. He examined Edmund for perhaps 10 minutes and signed the death certificate before the body was cold. Cardiac failure. Case closed. No inquest, no investigation, no questions asked. And the door had to be forced. Brennan, the groundskeeper, put his shoulder to it. The bolt was still thrown. Solid iron, Mr. Holmes. No trick to it. The windows were latched from within. I checked them myself. Holmes pressed his fingertips together beneath his chin. The posture I knew so well. The cathedral of his hands where deductions were offered up like prayers. A man locked in a room. No wound, no poison, no entry, no exit. And yet you say murder. He paused. It is, I confess, not without interest. I recognised the understatement for what it was. Holmes was already hooked, and no power in England would pull him free of this puzzle now. "Watson and I will be on the morning train to Hampshire," he said. "You will meet us at the station and take us directly to Wexford Hall. Touch nothing, disturb no one. And Mr. Hale," Holmes fixed him with a gaze that could have cut glass. "When we arrive, I shall require the truth, the whole truth, including those portions you have so carefully omitted this afternoon." Gerald Hale's face went pale. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then simply nodded. When the door had closed behind him, Holmes rose and crossed to the window, watching Hale's figure recede into the grey January street. "Did you notice, Watson, what he did not say? He named no suspect, he offered no theory. A man who believes his brother was murdered and has no idea by whom is one kind of client. A man who suspects exactly by whom but cannot bring himself to say so. That is a rather different kind altogether." Holmes turned from the window, and his eyes held the cold, bright light of a hunter-sighting quarry. "Pack your bag and bring your revolver. I think Hampshire shall prove rather more interesting than London this week." Chapter 2. Wexford Hall. The morning train from Waterloo departed at 7:08, and Holmes and I had a first-class compartment to ourselves. The city fell away in stages, first the terraces of Clapham, then the grey suburbs, and at last the open country of Surrey, all frozen fields and skeletal hedgerows under a sky the colour of old pewter. There had been no thaw for a week. Holmes sat opposite me with his eyes closed and his fingertips pressed together, and I knew better than to speak. I occupied myself with the morning paper, but my thoughts kept returning to Gerald Hale and his dead brother in the locked study. A room bolted from within, windows latched, no wound, no mark. If it was murder by a ghost. At Lambton Station we were met by Gerald Hale, who looked as though he had not slept since leaving Baker Street. He had arranged a dog cart, and we drove the 2 miles to Wexford Hall in near silence, the horses' hooves ringing on the frozen road. Wexford Hall appeared around a bend in the drive. It was a substantial Jacobean manor of dark stone, 3 stories high, with mullioned windows and dead ivy crawling up its eastern face. The house seemed to crouch against the hill behind it. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys only, though there were a dozen. The rest stood cold against the grey sky. "A cheerful prospect," Holmes murmured, though his eyes were already moving across the building's face with the systematic attention of a man reading a page of close print. We were received at the door by Mrs. Garrett, the housekeeper, a stout, brisk woman in full mourning, who carried herself with the grave efficiency of a woman who understood that a household does not stop because its master has died. "Lady Constance is in the morning room, sirs. She asks that you join her when you are ready." "We are ready now," said Holmes. She led us through a hallway of dark oak and flagstone. The house was cold, not merely chilly, but deeply, structurally cold, the kind that lives in stone walls and cannot be driven out. I noticed Holmes register this with a slight narrowing of his eyes. Lady Constance Hale rose to meet us, and I understood at once why Gerald had been unable to name her as a suspect. She was slender, with dark hair drawn simply back, and grey eyes that held a quiet intelligence. She wore black with an unaffected grace that made the mourning seem not a costume but an extension of her character. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I am grateful you have come. My brother-in-law believes my husband was murdered, and I confess I do not know what to believe. If there is truth to be found, I would rather it be found by capable hands." "You are very composed, Lady Constance, for a woman whose husband's death is under suspicion," Holmes observed. There was no accusation in his tone, merely the flat precision of a man noting a data point. "I have had 4 days to exhaust my capacity for distress, Mr. Holmes. What remains is a desire for clarity. I will help you in any way I can." "Then take me to the study." She led us down a corridor, and then a short flight of stone steps. The study was below the main floor, built into what had clearly been the old wine cellars. The air grew markedly colder with each step. The passage was narrow, lit by a single gas lamp, and ended at a heavy oak door. "This is as it was," Lady Constance said. "I have permitted nothing to be moved or cleaned." The study of Sir Edmund Hale was a room that resisted comfort. The walls were bare stone, 2 feet thick, the ceiling low and vaulted. A turkey carpet covered the flagstone floor, and the furnishings were handsome. A mahogany desk, bookshelves, a leather armchair before the fireplace, but the impression was of a chamber carved from the bones of the earth. The cold radiated from the walls like a physical force. The fireplace was large, built for the room's original purpose of storing wine at stable temperature, and the grate was full of ash. Holmes went to it first. He knelt and sifted the ash between his fingers, holding fragments up to the light from the single window. He said nothing, but I saw his nostrils flare. The ash had a peculiar smell, acrid and green, quite unlike the clean white ash of well-seasoned wood. I bent beside him. The ash was dark, spongy, incompletely consumed. Some pieces were barely charred at all. I could see the grain of the wood, tight and wet-looking, with a greenish tinge beneath the blackened surface. "This is green timber," I said. "It's unseasoned. It would smoulder rather than burn and throw more smoke than heat." "Very good, Watson." Holmes rose and crossed to Lady Constance, who stood in the doorway. "When was the firewood for this room changed?" A flicker of something, surprise perhaps, or something more careful, crossed her face. "Changed? I ordered new wood from a different supplier perhaps 3 weeks ago. The old wood smoked terribly. Edmund complained of it." "Did he? Which supplier?" "Hobson's, in Alton. I can find the receipt if you require it." "I shall require it." Holmes turned back to the room. He examined the door next. The bolt was heavy iron, sliding into a deep bracket set into the stone frame. Holmes tested it. Smooth, no scratches, no looseness, no sign of tampering. Sir Edmund bolted this door every evening?" "Without exception," said Lady Constance. "He valued his privacy." "And it was bolted when the body was found?" "Brennan had to break the door open." Holmes nodded and moved to the window. It was a single casement window, set deep in the thick stone wall, overlooking the east garden. The glass was old and slightly warped. The latch was a simple iron bar mounted on the interior, a horizontal piece that rotated on a central pin to lock the window shut. Holmes examined it with his magnifying lens for a long time, tilting his head to catch the light at different angles. He ran his finger along the wooden sill beneath the frame, then held the finger up and studied it. I could not see what he saw, but I watched his expression change, a subtle tightening, and the faintest contraction of his brow, and I knew that look. He had found something. He said nothing about it. Instead, he straightened and surveyed the room as a whole. "The armchair," he said. "Sir Edmund was found here?" Seated as if asleep, Lady Constance confirmed. A book in his lap, his reading spectacles on the side table, a glass beside them, brandy, his evening custom. Holmes picked up the crystal decanter that stood on the sideboard. He removed the stopper and brought it beneath his nose. He held it there for several seconds, then, to my surprise, touched his finger to the rim and tasted the residue. His expression did not change, but he replaced the stopper with the care of a man handling evidence. "Who pours Sir Edmund's brandy? He pours it himself?" "Ye always." "And this decanter, is it always kept here?" "For as long as I've lived in this house." Holmes set the decanter down precisely where he had found it. We returned upstairs, where Holmes questioned Mrs. Garrett. She confirmed the evening's account: dinner at 6, Sir Edmund retiring at 7:30, Lady Constance with Mrs. Garrett from 9 until 11. She described the morning discovery. No answer at the study door, Brennan summoned to force the bolt. "And the room, when you entered, how did it strike you?" Mrs. Garrett considered. "Cold, sir. Bitter cold. I remember thinking the fire must have gone out hours before, and there was a smell, damp, like wet wood. I thought it queer at the time, but then we saw the master, and I thought of nothing else." "Quite natural. One more question, Mrs. Garrett. In the weeks before Sir Edmund's death, did Lady Constance collect any parcels from the village? From the post office, perhaps?" Mrs. Garrett frowned in thought. "Now, you mention it, sir. Yes. 5 weeks ago, perhaps 6. She went into Lambton and came back with a parcel. Said it was fabric samples from a London draper. I didn't think anything of it." "No reason you should have. Thank you, Mrs. Garrett. You have been most helpful." As we crossed the entrance hall, a young woman descended the staircase. Slender, fair-haired, with a face drawn tight with anxiety. She stopped when she saw us, and her eyes met Holmes's with an expression I can only describe as hunted. "Miss Carey," said Lady Constance, with a gentleness that might have been genuine or might have been performance. "These are Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson. They are looking into Sir Edmund's death." "How do you do?" said Helena Carey, and her voice was barely above a whisper. She did not offer her hand. Her eyes dropped from Holmes's gaze as though it burned her, and she murmured something about needing air and slipped past us toward the garden door. Holmes watched her go with interest, but made no move to follow. Outside, as we walked the gravel path toward the gate where Gerald waited with the dog cart, Holmes was quiet. The wind cut across the frozen garden, rattling the bare branches of a yew hedge that ran along the east wall. Holmes stopped beside it and looked back at the house, specifically at the study window, visible from where we stood as a dark rectangle set low in the stone face. "Well, Watson, are your impressions? Lady Constance is either innocent or the finest actress in Hampshire. The room is unnaturally cold, even for a stone cellar. The wood in that fireplace was never meant to burn properly, and you found something at that window that you have not told me." Holmes permitted himself a thin smile. "I found scratches, Watson. Fresh scratches on old iron where no scratches should be, and a smell in a brandy decanter that is not brandy." He looked up at the grey sky, then back at the dark bulk of Wexford Hall. "This house has secrets, and they are kept in the cold. We shall return tomorrow with sharper tools and longer hours. There is a thread here, Watson. I can feel it between my fingers, but I cannot yet see where it leads." He turned up his collar against the wind, and we walked in silence to the waiting cart. And behind us the windows of Wexford Hall stared out like blind eyes over the frozen garden, and I could not shake the feeling that someone, from behind those dark panes, was watching us go. #Chapter 3, The Doctor's Haste. We began the following morning with Dr. Philip Marsh. His surgery occupied the ground floor of a handsome brick house on Lambton's High Street. The waiting room was furnished with a quality unusual for a country practice. New chairs in green leather, a Turkey rug that had not been down 6 months, and on the mantelpiece a bottle of claret that would have cost more than most village doctors earn in a day. Holmes catalogued the room in a single sweep before we were shown through. The doctor was 50, portly, and genial in the manner of a man who has cultivated geniality as a professional instrument. He greeted us with excessive warmth, offered tea, and remarked on the winter as though we had come to discuss the weather. "A sad business," he said, settling into his chair. "Sir Edmund was a patient of mine for 15 years. Sound constitution on the whole. A touch of gout. Occasional chest complaints in the damp months. Nothing serious. But the heart is a treacherous organ, Mr. Holmes. It keeps its own counsel." "Indeed," said Holmes, "and you examined Sir Edmund's heart on the morning of January the 13th. "I did. Called at 7:30. Lady Constance sent for me at once." "Describe the examination, if you would." Marsh spread his hands. "The usual procedure. I checked for pulse. None. Listened for heartbeat. None. Examined the pupils. Fixed and dilated. Checked the extremities. Cold, beginning to stiffen. The signs were entirely consistent with cardiac arrest, occurring some hours before discovery." "How long did this examination take?" "Oh, 10 minutes perhaps. 15. 10 minutes, Holmes repeated, as though tasting the words. For a man of 58, found dead in unusual circumstances, in a locked room, with no prior history of serious cardiac disease. 10 minutes. Marsh's geniality cooled by several degrees. "The circumstances were not unusual, Mr. Holmes. A man died in his study by the fire. It happens every winter in every county in England." "Did you note the temperature of the room?" "It was cold. The fire had gone out." "Very cold. Unusually cold." "Cold, Mr. Holmes. I did not bring a thermometer to a death examination." "Did you note the condition of the ash in the fireplace?" "I did not examine the fireplace. I examined the body." "For 10 minutes." Marsh's face had gone the colour of the brick outside his window. "I signed the death certificate in good conscience, sir. Cardiac failure. If you have evidence to the contrary, I should be very interested to hear it." Holmes smiled, the smile that Watson would have recognised as his most dangerous. "I have questions, Dr. Marsh. Nothing more. Tell me, you mentioned Sir Edmund's occasional chest complaints. Did you bill these treatments to the household account at Wexford Hall?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, and Marsh blinked. Yes, as is customary. Lady Constance manages the household accounts." "And you have also, I understand, been treating Lady Constance's mother in Dublin. Those bills also charged to the Wexford Hall account." Marsh went very still. Lady Constance asked me to arrange certain consultations through Dublin colleagues. The charges were appropriate." "I am sure they were. One final question. Sir Edmund lent you £300 some 18 months ago. Had he begun pressing for repayment?" The silence in the surgery was absolute. Marsh stared at Holmes with the expression of a man who has stepped onto what he believed to be solid ground and found nothing beneath his foot. "How—" He stopped. He collected himself with visible effort. "That is a private financial matter, Mr. Holmes, and has nothing to do with Sir Edmund's death. Everything has to do with Sir Edmund's death until I determine otherwise. Good morning, Dr. Marsh." Outside, the cold hit us like a wall. Holmes walked briskly, his breath trailing behind him in white threads. "He is hiding something," I said. "He is hiding several things, Watson, and none of them reflect well upon him. The claret and the new furniture suggest an income beyond his practice. The Dublin billing arrangement is, I suspect, rather more generous than Lady Constance's mother's ailments require, and a man who owes his patient £300 and signs a 10-minute death certificate has, at the very least, a powerful motive for not looking too closely." "You think Marsh is involved?" "I think Marsh is lazy and self-interested, which in this instance amounts to nearly the same thing. His negligence may have enabled a perfect crime. Whether he is complicit or merely convenient, that remains to be seen." We walked on to the Crown and Thistle at the far end of the village. The innkeeper, a sharp-eyed man named Crouch, was happy to talk, once Holmes produced a half-sovereign. "Mr. Gerald Hale, yes, sir. Arrived a week before Sir Edmund died. Took a room on the first floor. Kept to himself mostly, except in the evenings. He'd sit in the common room, drink whisky, and read the London papers. Quiet gentleman. Seemed worried about something." "And on the night of January the 12th, Crouch thought carefully. "He was in the common room until about 10 o'clock. Had 2 whiskies, maybe 3. Then he put on his coat and went out. I remember because it was a foul night. Bitter cold, black as pitch. I said to him, 'You'll catch your death out there, sir,' and he said, 'Perhaps that's what I deserve.'" Holmes and I exchanged a glance. "And when did he return?" "Past midnight. Closer to 1, I'd say. I was locking up. He came in through the front door, looking frozen through, mud on his boots, and went straight upstairs without a word." "The mud? Was it the red clay of this area?" "Couldn't say for certain, sir, but the road to Wexford Hall is red clay, if that's what you're asking." Holmes thanked Crouch and we departed. Gerald's midnight walk was now established. Out at 10, gone for nearly 3 hours, returning with mud consistent with the road to Wexford Hall. The picture it painted was damning, and I said as much. "It paints a picture," Holmes agreed. "Whether it is the correct picture is another matter entirely. A man who walks to his brother's estate in the dead of night and returns 3 hours later with mud on his boots could be a murderer. He could also be a coward who spent 3 hours trying to find the courage to knock on a door. Or we shall need more than mud to distinguish between the two." It was now 10:30, and Holmes announced that we would return to Wexford Hall, not through the front entrance, but around the perimeter of the grounds. The frost had held for 6 days without interruption, and he wanted to examine the exterior of the house before the weather turned. We approached from the south, following the estate wall until we reached the east side, where the study window looked out over the garden. The ground here was a narrow bed of turned earth between the wall and a yew hedge, frozen solid, the frost lying in a thick, unbroken crust. Except that it was not unbroken. Holmes stopped, held up his hand, and crouched. I followed his gaze and saw what he saw. Footprints, 2 distinct sets, are pressed into the frozen earth at different points along the garden bed. The first set was large, a man's boot, heavy-soled, broad heel. These prints approached from the main gate, came within 20 yards of the house, and turned back. They did not reach the study window. "Gerald," Holmes said. "He came to the gate, walked part way up, lost his nerve, and retreated. The prints of a man wrestling with his conscience, not committing a crime." The second set was different. They were small, a woman's boot, narrow-soled, with a distinctive wear pattern. The left heel was worn more heavily than the right, producing a slight inward cant to each left footprint. The prints led from the kitchen door along the east wall in the shadow of the yew hedge, directly beneath the study window. There they clustered, as though the person had stood for some time, and then returned by the same route. Holmes said nothing for a long while. He measured the stride with his walking stick, studied the depth, and examined the clustering beneath the window with particular intensity. "A woman," I said, "beneath the study window in the middle of the night. Stationary for an hour or more, Watson. The depth and multiplication of prints tell us that. One does not stand in a frozen garden at midnight for an hour without very pressing reason. Lady Constance, Holmes straightened. The prints are consistent with her build, but I will not name her on footprints alone. Now, what I will say is this. Whoever stood there had a purpose connected to the room on the other side of the glass. The room in which Sir Edmund died. He looked up at the study window, the dark casement, latched shut, set deep in the stone wall, and I saw his jaw tighten. There are 5 people in this affair, Watson, and each is lying about something. Gerald lies about his reasons for coming to Hampshire. Marsh lies about his examination. Helena Carey lies about her movements. Her chapped hands tell me she was outside for hours. Lady Constance lies about... well, that is the question. And there is a 6th figure we have not yet examined. Thomas Brennan, the groundskeeper, who has the skills of a blacksmith and the keys to every door on this estate. He turned from the window and walked toward the road. We have a locked room. A dead man with no wound. A fire never meant to burn. A brandy that was not brandy. Scratches on a window latch. And 2 sets of footprints, one belonging to a man who could not bring himself to act, and another belonging to someone who could. He paused at the gate. Tomorrow I shall want Brennan's workshop, Lady Constance's correspondence, and the household accounts. This case has 5 suspects, Watson, and every one of them had reason to wish Sir Edmund dead, but only one stood beneath that window. #Chapter 4. The Secrets of the Household. Holmes was silent over breakfast at the Crown and Thistle, which I had learned to interpret not as absence but as intensity. He ate mechanically, toast, 2 cups of black coffee, while his eyes fixed on the middle distance with the focus of a man assembling invisible architecture. And at last he said, "Today, Watson, we listen. Every person in that household is concealing something. Our task is to apply pressure, gently, precisely, and observe what escapes." We arrived at Wexford Hall at 9:30. Mrs. Garrett received us in the servants' hall, a plain, scrubbed room below stairs, warm from the kitchen range. She sat opposite us with her hands folded, composed and watchful. Holmes began with the household routine. Mrs. Garrett described it with the precision of a woman for whom routine was not merely habit but principle. Meals at fixed hours, fires laid at 6 in the morning, banked at 10 at night. Sir Edmund's study fire was always prepared by the housemaid Alice, using wood from the designated pile in the scullery passage. And 3 weeks before Sir Edmund's death, the wood for the study was changed. Yes, sir, Lady Constance ordered it. She said the old wood smoked something terrible and Sir Edmund had complained. The new lot came from Hobson's in Alton, delivered by cart and stacked separately, just for the study. Did Sir Edmund comment on the new wood? Mrs. Garrett hesitated. He did, sir, but not in the way Lady Constance suggested. He said the new wood was worse, all smoke and no heat. He told me the fire wouldn't catch properly and the room was cold as a crypt. I offered to have Brennan check the flue, but Lady Constance said she'd handle it. Holmes absorbed this without expression. And the parcel from Lambton. You mentioned Lady Constance collected it some weeks before the death. 5 weeks? Perhaps 6. She went into the village in the afternoon and came back with a parcel wrapped in brown paper. She said it was fabric samples from a London draper. She'd been talking about new curtains for the drawing room. I didn't think it odd at the time. And were new curtains ever ordered? A pause. Mrs. Garrett's brow creased. No, sir. Now you mention it, I don't believe they were. One more question. On the evening of January the 12th, you and Lady Constance were together in the upstairs sitting room from 9 o'clock until 11. During that time, did Lady Constance leave the room at any point? Not that I recall, sir. We were sewing. She was working on an embroidery frame, and we talked. She seemed her usual self, calm, perhaps a touch quiet. And after 11, when she retired, I went to my own room, sir. I didn't see or hear anything further until the morning. Holmes thanked her, and we ascended to the main floor. Helena Carey was in the morning room, seated by the window with a book she was not reading. She rose when we entered, and I saw again that taut, watchful quality, a young woman braced for a blow she could not predict. Holmes was gentle, almost conversational. He asked about her life at Wexford Hall, her relationship with Sir Edmund. Helena answered in short, careful sentences, her eyes moving between Holmes and the door. You retired to your room at 9:30, on the night of January the 12th? Yes. And you remained there until morning? Yes. The word came too quickly, and she knew it. A faint colour rose in her cheeks. Holmes let the silence stretch. Then, with apparent casualness, he said, May I see your hands, Miss Carey? She blinked. My hands? If you would be so kind. Helena extended her hands. The skin was chapped and reddened, not merely dry from winter air, but raw, as though exposed to prolonged cold. The knuckles were rough, the fingertips cracked. These were not the hands of a woman who had spent that night in a warm bedroom. You have been outdoors a great deal recently, Holmes observed. I walk in the gardens. The fresh air helps me sleep. At night, Miss Carey? The colour in her cheeks deepened to crimson. I don't know what you mean. Holmes regarded her steadily. I think you do, but I will not press the point today. I will only say that if there is something you wish to tell me, something you believe has no connection to Sir Edmund's death, I am rather better at keeping confidences than you might suppose. Helena said nothing, but I saw her hands tighten in her lap, and her eyes glistened, and she looked away toward the window with an expression that was not guilt, but anguish. We left her, and went in search of Thomas Brennan. The groundskeeper was in the stable yard, mending a fence rail. He was 45, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face and the thick, scarred fingers of a former blacksmith. He set down his hammer when he saw us, and I noticed he did not meet Holmes's eye. Mr. Brennan, I understand you have been groundskeeper at Wexford Hall for 12 years. 13, sir, since the old master's time, and in that time you have come to know the house and grounds intimately. I know every stone and beam, sir. I built half the fences and repaired the other half, including the study. You maintain the fireplace, the flue, the window mechanisms. Brennan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I do general maintenance, sir. If something needs fixing, I fix it. The study fireplace? When did you last inspect the flue? I offered to check it 4 weeks ago. The master said the fires weren't drawing right, but Lady Constance told me she'd had the wood changed instead, and that would solve it. And did it? No, sir. Green wood won't burn proper no matter what you do with it. I told her as much, but she said the old supplier was unreliable and to leave it be. Holmes shifted direction. You have a workshop on the grounds, a forge. Brennan stiffened. The change was subtle but unmistakable, a tightening of the shoulders, a stillness in the hands. A small one, sir, for estate work. Hinges, brackets, tools. What sort of tools? Whatever's needed. Gate latches, fence pins, hooks for the stable. Has anyone recently asked you to make anything unusual? A specialised tool, perhaps? The silence lasted a beat too long. Lady Constance asked me to make a long-handled tool for the attic. There's a window up there with a latch that sticks. You can't reach it without something to extend your arm. I made her a hook on a rod. Seemed a sensible enough request. When was this? 2 weeks before the master died. Perhaps 3. And you have the tool still? Or a prototype? Brennan's face had gone the colour of old plaster. I might have a practice piece in the workshop. I often make a rough version first to get the dimensions right. Holmes nodded as though this were the most natural thing in the world. I should very much like to see your workshop, Mr. Brennan, but not today. Tomorrow will do. We walked back toward the house in silence. Holmes spoke first. 3 testimonies, 3 revelations. Mrs. Garrett tells us the firewood change was Lady Constance's doing, and that Sir Edmund complained the new wood was worse, the opposite of Lady Constance's claim. The Lambton parcel was explained as fabric samples, yet no curtains were ordered, and Brennan made a specialised hook tool at Lady Constance's request, in 2 weeks before the death. And Helena? Helena is hiding something that causes her genuine distress, but I do not yet believe it is murder. Her fear is of exposure, not detection. There is a difference. We had reached the garden path. Holmes stopped walking and turned to face me. "Watson, I need your medical opinion. Consider the following scenario. A man of 58 in good health retires to a stone-walled room in January. He drinks 3 glasses of spirit considerably stronger than he realises. Not drugged, merely higher proof than his customary brandy. He falls into deep, alcohol-induced unconsciousness. The fire, built with green, unseasoned timber, dies within 2 hours. The room, stone walls, stone floor, vaulted ceiling, loses heat rapidly. Now suppose that at some point during the night, a window is opened, admitting air well below freezing, and left open for an hour or more. The man does not wake. What happens to him?" I stared at Holmes. The scenario assembled itself in my mind with horrible clarity. "Hypothermia," I said. "His core temperature would drop steadily. In deep unconsciousness, with no shivering response, the alcohol dilating his blood vessels and accelerating heat loss. In a room at or below freezing, with no fire and an open window, he would be dead within 3 or 4 hours, and the cause of death would be virtually indistinguishable from cardiac arrest." Holmes's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a cold, precise satisfaction, like a key turning in a lock. "Virtually indistinguishable," he repeated, "especially to a doctor who examines the body for 10 minutes, in a room that has warmed slightly by morning, and who has every reason not to look too closely. Good God, Holmes, you're saying someone froze him to death in his own study." "I am saying that is the hypothesis which fits every fact we have gathered. The green wood, the brandy that was not brandy, the scratches on the window latch, the footprints beneath the window, a woman standing in the frozen garden for over an hour, the time required for the room to reach lethal temperature." He paused. "It is, I will admit, one of the most elegant methods of murder I have ever encountered. No weapon, no poison, no forced entry, only the cold itself, turned against a sleeping man in a room of stone. The wind stirred the bare branches of the yew hedge, and for a moment the only sound was the creak of frozen wood." "But elegant is not the same as proven," Holmes said quietly. "I have a theory, Watson. What I need now is evidence. Tomorrow, the workshop, the window, and the brandy decanter. If I am right, the proof is there. And if I am right, then someone in this house committed a murder so carefully constructed that it was designed to leave no trace at all, and very nearly succeeded. Hashtag Chapter 5, The Window and the Forge." Holmes rose before dawn. I found him already dressed and pacing the narrow room at the Crown and Thistle when I came down at 7, his face sharp with the particular energy that preceded a day of decisive action. "The study first," he said, pulling on his gloves. "I was too cautious on our first visit, observing when I should have been measuring. Today I shall take that window apart with my eyes, and it will tell me everything." We reached Wexford Hall by 8. Lady Constance was not yet visible, and Mrs. Garrett admitted us without question. Holmes moved through the house with the authority of a man who had ceased to regard himself as a guest, and assumed the role of something closer to a surgeon, clinical, purposeful, immune to social propriety. The study was as we had left it. The cold struck us as we descended the stone steps, and I buttoned my coat instinctively. Holmes did not seem to notice. He went directly to the casement window and stood before it for a full minute without moving, his head slightly tilted, reading the surface of the thing the way a scholar reads a palimpsest. Then he produced his magnifying lens and began. He started with the latch, the simple iron bar, 6 inches long, and mounted horizontally on a central pin. When turned perpendicular to the frame, it locked the window shut. Holmes examined the bar's upper surface first, then its sides, then, crouching low to catch the pale morning light at an oblique angle, its underside. "Watson, come here." I knelt beside him. He held the lens so I could see. On the underside of the iron latch bar, where the metal was dark with age and patina, there were scratches. Fresh scratches, bright lines of bare metal against the blackened surface running parallel, as though something narrow and hard had been drawn across the iron repeatedly. The marks were fine and deliberately consistent, not the random scoring of wear, but the purposeful contact of a tool. "Something was pressed against this bar from below," Holmes said. "A thin, rigid implement. Be inserted beneath the latch, engaged with the underside, and rotated to turn the bar. You see these parallel lines? They indicate multiple attempts, the tool slipping, being repositioned, and finally catching. Someone learned how to do this, Watson. Practiced it." He moved to the windowsill. The gap between the casement frame and the sill was narrow, perhaps 1/4 of an inch, but Holmes probed it with a thin steel rule from his pocket and confirmed that a flat implement could be inserted from the outside. "Now look here." He directed my attention to the wooden sill at the point where the gap was widest. There were scratches in the wood as well, faint parallel grooves, as though a thin blade or rod had been pushed through repeatedly. The wood was soft with age, and the marks were unmistakable once you knew to look for them. Holmes straightened. His expression was that of a man who has opened an envelope and found exactly the letter he expected. "The window was opened from outside," he said, "and closed and relatched from outside. The door was never touched. Sir Edmund bolted it himself when he retired alive and well. The murderer never entered the room. What entered was the cold." "But how? The latch is on the interior. You cannot reach it from outside without a purpose-made tool. A narrow iron hook, approximately 14 inches long, with a right-angled bend at the tip, thin enough to slide through the gap between frame and sill, rigid enough to engage the latch bar, long enough to provide the leverage to turn it." He paused. "A tool, Watson, that a skilled blacksmith could forge in an afternoon. Shall we visit Mr. Brennan's workshop?" The workshop stood at the far end of the stable yard, a low stone building with a corrugated iron roof. Brennan was not present. Holmes had asked Mrs. Garrett to send him to the village on an errand. The interior was a working estate forge, a brick hearth with bellows, an anvil scarred and blackened, racks of tools along the walls. A heavy wooden workbench occupied the centre, and it was to this that Holmes went first. The surface of the bench was scored with years of use, but Holmes was not interested in old marks. He ran his fingers across the wood near the vise and held them up. Iron filings clung to his fingertips, fine, dark particles, fresh enough to be magnetic when he touched them to the steel rule. "Recent work," he said. "Someone has been grinding iron on this bench within the last month." He examined the vise next. The jaws showed marks consistent with clamping a narrow cylindrical rod, the kind of marks a thin iron bar would leave when held for filing or bending. Holmes measured the jaw width and the spacing of the pressure marks. Then he found it. On a shelf beneath the bench, half hidden behind a tin of nails, lay an iron piece. It was roughly made, a rod of iron approximately 12 inches long with a right-angled bend at one end, the tip filed to a narrow edge. A prototype, a practice piece. Cruder than the finished tool would be, but unmistakably the same design. Holmes held it up to the light. He turned it slowly in his fingers, examining the bend angle, the tip width, the filing marks. Then he carried it to the window. I held it against the gap in the sill and nodded once. The dimensions match. This is the rough version. Brennan made this first to test the concept, then forged a refined version for Lady Constance. The finished tool is the one that was used on the study window. This is its ghost. He set it down carefully and turned his attention to the workbench surface once more. With his lens he examined the iron filings closely, collecting a small sample in an envelope from his pocket. I will wager, Watson, that these filings match the composition of the scratches on the study windowsill precisely. The same grade of iron, the same tool that left its marks on the latch left its shavings on this bench. We returned to the study. Holmes wished to examine the brandy decanter one final time. He poured a small measure into a glass and held it to the light. The colour was right for brandy, but when he swirled it, the legs ran heavier and slower than fine cognac should produce. "Taste it," he said, handing me the glass. I did. The first impression was of brandy, the warmth, the fruit, but beneath it was something harsher, rawer, with a burn that hit the back of the throat like a coal. It was not unpleasant, but it was emphatically not French cognac. "Rum," I said, "strong rum. Naval strength, if I'm not mistaken." "You are not mistaken. This is approximately 140 proof. Naval issue rum of the kind sold by specialist merchants. A man accustomed to 3 nightly glasses of fine brandy at 80 proof would consume the same quantity without thinking, but the effect would be profoundly different. 3 glasses of this would not make him drowsy, Watson. It would render him insensible, deeply, completely unconscious, not sleeping but overcome, as surely as if he had been chloroformed. And he wouldn't notice the difference? Sir Edmund was a habitual drinker with a palate dulled by years of nightly spirits. The rum was decanted into his own crystal brandy bottle, the familiar vessel, the familiar colour, the expected ritual. A fresh bottle might have aroused suspicion, but this was his own decanter, refilled. The deception required only that the substitute be close enough in appearance to pass casual inspection. In a dimly lit study, poured by a man who expected brandy and therefore tasted brandy, it would work. And it did work. Holmes replaced the decanter and stood in the centre of the study. His gaze moved slowly around the room, the cold stone walls, the dead fireplace, the armchair where Sir Edmund had spent his final hours, the window with its scarred latch. "Let me tell you how Sir Edmund Hale died, Watson. He retired to this room at 7:30, as was his custom. He bolted the door himself. The fire was already built with green, unseasoned timber that would smoulder and die within 2 hours. The flue was open wide, drawing cold air down into the room even as the fire failed. He poured his first glass from the decanter, rum, not brandy, and began to read. By his 3rd glass he was profoundly unconscious. By 10 o'clock the fire was dead. The room began to cool. At midnight, the murderer walked from the kitchen door around the east side of the house to this window, using the iron hook tool. As she unlatched the casement from outside and opened it wide, January air, 5 degrees below freezing, flooded a stone room already cold and losing heat. She waited an hour, perhaps 90 minutes, in the shadow of the yew hedge, while the temperature dropped to lethal levels. Then she closed the window, relatched it from outside with the same tool, walked back to the kitchen door, went to bed, and Sir Edmund Hale, who never woke, who never stirred, whose body simply surrendered its warmth to the frozen air around it, died of hypothermia in his own armchair. By morning the room had warmed just enough to seem merely cold rather than freezing. A lazy doctor examined him for 10 minutes and wrote cardiac failure, and the perfect crime was complete. The silence in the study was absolute. "You keep saying she," I said quietly. Sir Holmes looked at me. His grey eyes held neither triumph nor satisfaction. only a cold, careful precision. The footprints beneath the window are a woman's. The firewood was changed on a woman's order. The brandy was switched by someone with access to this room and this decanter. Someone who knew Sir Edmund's habits intimately. The hook tool was commissioned by a woman who gave a plausible, false explanation. Every thread, Watson, leads to the same hand. He paused. But I will not name her. Not yet. I have the method. I have the means. What I need now is the proof that connects the instrument to the hand. The receipt, the motive, the moment when deduction becomes evidence. And I need the tool itself. Not the prototype, but the finished weapon, which is somewhere on these grounds. Hidden by a woman who was thorough enough to plan a murder by temperature, and clever enough to commit it without ever entering the room where her husband died. Hashtag Chapter 6. The Ward's Midnight Secret. That afternoon, Holmes did something I had not anticipated. Rather than press his advantage toward Lady Constance, as I expected, and I confess urged, he turned his attention to Helena Carey. We cannot build a case with gaps, Watson. Helena Carey was in that house on the night of the murder, had motive to wish Sir Edmund dead, and has lied about her movements. Until I have accounted for her, she remains a loose thread, and loose threads unravel prosecutions. You don't believe she did it? I believe the evidence points elsewhere, but belief is not proof, and I have been wrong before. Rarely, but memorably. We must know where Helena Carey was between 11 o'clock and 2 in the morning on January the 12th, and she will not tell us willingly. Therefore, we must discover it for ourselves. Holmes spent the early afternoon at Wexford Hall in what appeared to be casual observation, reading in the morning room, exchanging pleasantries with Mrs. Garrett. But his attention never left Helena Carey. He tracked her movements with the peripheral awareness of a cat watching a bird through half-closed eyes. At 3 o'clock, Helena put on her coat and went out through the garden door. Holmes gave her 2 minutes, then followed. I remained in the morning room as instructed. He returned 40 minutes later and said nothing until we were alone. Then he produced a folded slip of paper. She walked to the edge of the estate, the old tree line beyond the walled garden. There is an ancient oak there with a hollow at the base. She placed this inside and walked back. He unfolded the note. The handwriting was hasty, slanted, and the ink had been applied with a trembling hand. J.W. I cannot bear it much longer. He asks questions I cannot answer and sees things I cannot hide. Tonight, the usual place, at 11. I must see you. I must know what we are to do. H**. J.W., I said. Who is J.W.? That is what we shall discover tonight. The usual place suggests an established meeting point. Somewhere on the estate grounds, private, accessible after dark. The old gamekeeper's lodge, I would wager. I noticed it on our walk yesterday. Abandoned, screened by trees, perhaps a quarter-mile from the house. An ideal location for a clandestine meeting. A lover? Almost certainly. And if Helena Carey has been meeting a man secretly at night, it would explain a great deal. Her chapped hands, her anxiety, her desperate lie about remaining in her room. An unmarried woman of 26, under the guardianship of a man who controlled her finances and forbade her to see the man she loved. She would have every reason to conceal her movements, and every reason to fear exposure. But it also means she was outside the house during the critical hours. Precisely, which is why we must determine whether her meeting constitutes an alibi or an opportunity. We dined at the Crown and Thistle, and returned to Wexford Hall on foot as darkness fell. The night was clear and bitter, a half-moon casting blue-white light across the frozen landscape, the stars hard and bright overhead, our breath plumed in the still air. Holmes led us along the estate wall to a point where the stonework had crumbled low enough to climb, and we crossed into the grounds without passing the gate. The gamekeeper's lodge was exactly where Holmes had predicted, a small stone building in a clearing among bare oaks. its roof still intact but its windows dark and empty. We positioned ourselves behind a fallen trunk some 30 yards distant, wrapped in our coats, and waited. The cold was savage. I pulled my scarf over my nose and still felt the frost creeping through my clothing. Holmes beside me was motionless, apparently impervious to temperature. At 10 minutes past 11, a figure appeared on the path from the house. Helena Carey, in a dark cloak with the hood drawn up, moving quickly and quietly through the moonlight. She went directly to the lodge, pushed open the door, and disappeared inside. A moment later, a faint glow appeared in the window, a candle. 5 minutes after that, a second figure approached from the opposite direction, from the lane beyond the estate's northern boundary. A man, tall, moving with the upright carriage of a military officer. He wore a heavy greatcoat and a cap pulled low. He entered the lodge without hesitation, and the door closed behind him. Holmes touched my arm. We waited. Half an hour passed. Low voices reached us through the lodge walls, urgent, emotional, occasionally breaking into what sounded like tearful argument. I could not make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Two people in distress are clinging to each other against circumstances they could not control. At midnight, Holmes rose silently and crossed the clearing. I followed. He knocked twice on the lodge door. The voices stopped. Then the door opened and Helena stared at us with the wide eyes of absolute terror. "Miss Carey," Holmes said quietly. "And Captain Whitfield, I presume." The man behind her stepped forward. He was 30, perhaps 32, with an honest, weathered face and the bearing of a professional soldier. His hand went instinctively to Helena's shoulder, protective, possessive, afraid. "Who are you?" he demanded. "My name is Sherlock Holmes. I'm investigating the death of Sir Edmund Hale. And I believe the two of you have something to tell me that you would very much rather not." Helena's composure broke. The tears she had been holding since we first met her came at last. Not the gentle weeping of a lady in a novel, but the raw, gulping sobs of a woman whose secret has been torn open. Captain Whitfield held her and glared at Holmes with the fierce, helpless anger of a man who cannot protect the person he loves. Holmes waited. He did not press. He did not threaten. He simply stood in the doorway of that cold stone lodge, patient as a priest at confession, until the storm passed. Helena told us everything. His name was James Whitfield, Captain James Whitfield of the 2nd Hampshire Regiment, on half pay, living in lodgings in Alton. They had met 18 months ago at a county assembly. Sir Edmund had forbidden the match. Whitfield had no fortune and no connections, and Sir Edmund had threatened to extend the trust restrictions on Helena's inheritance indefinitely if she married without consent. They had continued to meet in secret. The gamekeeper's lodge had been their place for 6 months. Helena would slip out after the household retired and return before 2 in the morning. "And on the night of January the 12th, Holmes asked. Helena pressed her hands together. "I left my room at 11. I came here. James was already waiting. We stayed until nearly 2 and I went back to the house. I entered through the garden door and went to bed. I heard nothing. I saw nothing. I didn't know Edmund was dead until Mrs. Garrett raised the alarm in the morning." Holmes turned to Whitfield. "Can you confirm the times?" "I can. I arrived at 11:15. Helena came at 11. We were together until she left at 10 minutes before 2. I can tell you exactly, because I check my watch habitually, a soldier's habit." "And during those 3 hours, did you see or hear anything unusual? Anyone else on the grounds?" Whitfield considered carefully. "Nothing. The grounds were silent. No light from the house that I could see. The only sound was the wind." Holmes studied them both for a long moment. Then he said, "Miss Carey, I believe you. You were not in your room on the night Sir Edmund died, but you were not at his window either. Your secret is not the one I am looking for." The relief that broke across Helena's face was painful to witness. "Will you—" She stopped. Must you tell anyone? I see no reason why the details of your whereabouts should become public knowledge. Your alibi will be recorded as confirmed by an independent witness. The nature of that witness need not be specified. He paused. But I would counsel you, Miss Carey, that secrets kept too long become prisons of their own. Captain Whitfield strikes me as a man worth acknowledging in daylight. Whitfield's hand tightened on Helena's shoulder, and she leaned into him, and for a moment the cold stone lodge was illuminated by something warmer than the guttering candle. We left them and walked back across the frozen grounds toward the village road. The moon was high now, the shadows sharp-edged and blue. That eliminates Helena, I said. Completely. Her alibi is solid. Whitfield is a credible witness. His account aligns with hers in every detail, and her movements from 11 to 2 are accounted for, and she was a mile from the study window during the critical hours. Which leaves Lady Constance. Holmes did not respond immediately. We walked in silence for a time, our boots crunching on the frozen road. Then he said, "There is one more piece of evidence I need before I confront her. The rum. The naval strength rum that was placed in the brandy decanter. It had to come from somewhere, Watson. It was not purchased locally. I have checked every spirits merchant within 20 miles. It was ordered from London, and I need to find the trail." "The Lambton parcel," I said. "The one Mrs. Garrett mentioned." "Yes. The parcel collected under the pretext of fabric samples. If that parcel contained a case of naval rum, and if it was ordered under a false name, then the chain of evidence is nearly complete. How do we prove it? The village post office. Every parcel received at a country post office is logged. Sender, recipient, date, weight. And the postmistress, Watson, is precisely the sort of woman who remembers everything and forgets nothing. We shall call on her first thing tomorrow." He glanced up at the cold stars. "We are close, Watson. One more day. The solicitor for the will, the post office for the parcel, and Lady Constance's correspondence. By tomorrow evening, I shall either have my case or I shall not. And if I do—" He paused, and something in his voice grew quieter. "If I do, then I must decide what to do with it. Because this is not a case of a monster, Watson. This is a case of a woman who saw no other way out. And that is rather harder to resolve than a simple question of guilt." He said nothing more, and we walked to the inn in silence. Number 7. The Widow's Accounts. Holmes was at the door of Mr. Phelps's office in Lambton High Street before the solicitor had finished his morning tea. I had rarely seen him so purposeful. There was a tightness in his movements, a controlled urgency, as though every minute that passed without resolution was a minute in which evidence might be destroyed or a story further rehearsed. Phelps was a thin, precise man of 60 with wire spectacles and the careful habits of a country solicitor who had served the same families for decades. He regarded Holmes with cautious respect. "I must be direct, Mr. Phelps. I am investigating the death of Sir Edmund Hale, and I require information that you may consider confidential. I assure you that my interest is not idle, and that the matter is considerably more serious than the coroner's certificate suggests." Phelps studied Holmes over the rim of his spectacles. Then he removed them, polished them slowly, and replaced them. The gesture I suspected of a man buying time to decide how much to say. "Sir Edmund was my client for 22 years, Mr. Holmes. I owe his memory a duty of care. But if you are suggesting that his death was not natural, then I owe him something more than discretion." "I am suggesting exactly that." Phelps nodded once, as though a decision had been reached. "Then ask your questions." "Sir Edmund's will, the current will, the one in force at the time of his death. What does it provide?" "Lady Constance inherits Wexford Hall, the London property in Mayfair, and an annuity of £12,000 per year drawn from the estate's investments. Miss Helena Carey's trust remains in effect until she reaches 30, or marries with the trustees' approval. With Sir Edmund's death, the trusteeship defaults to a neutral party, which is to say myself. Gerald Hale receives a bequest of £500 and nothing more. And Sir Edmund was preparing a new will. Phelps hesitated. Then, he was. He came to me 3 days before his death, January the 9th, in considerable agitation. He instructed me to draft a new will that would eliminate Lady Constance entirely. No estate, no annuity, no provision whatsoever. The London property was to be sold and the proceeds placed in trust for Miss Carey. Our Wexford Hall was to pass to Gerald, with conditions. On what grounds did Sir Edmund wish to disinherit his wife? He had discovered that Lady Constance had been secretly diverting household funds, small amounts over a long period, nearly £400 in total. He was furious. He spoke of fraud, betrayal, violation of marital trust. He also mentioned pursuing an annulment on grounds of fraudulent concealment of debts. Apparently Lady Constance's family had financial difficulties that were not disclosed before the marriage. And the signing of this new will, when was it scheduled? January the 15th, 3 days after Sir Edmund's death. The words hung in the air. Holmes let them settle before speaking again. So, Lady Constance stood to lose everything: estate, income, home, all social position, unless Sir Edmund died before January the 15th. That is the inescapable arithmetic, Mr. Holmes. Did Lady Constance know about the new will? Phelps frowned. Sir Edmund did not tell her directly to my knowledge, but I sent a letter to Sir Edmund on January the 10th, confirming the appointment for the 15th and enclosing the draft for his review. That letter was delivered to Wexford Hall by the afternoon post. Delivered to Wexford Hall? Not to Sir Edmund personally. No, to the house. Lady Constance manages the household post. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. A letter confirming the date on which Lady Constance's entire future would be destroyed, delivered into her own hands. One final matter. You mentioned Gerald Hale. Like Sir Edmund's relationship with his brother. Phelps chose his words carefully. Sir Edmund had recently learned that Gerald was in serious financial difficulty. He had written to the Law Society expressing concern about irregularities in Gerald's management of client trust funds. He believed Gerald had been embezzling. He had also refused Gerald's request for a loan in terms I can only describe as brutal. Did Sir Edmund intend to pursue the matter? He did. The letter to the Law Society was dated January the 8th. Holmes thanked Phelps and we departed. On the pavement outside he paused and stood very still, his eyes fixed on nothing. Gerald's motive is now fully illuminated, he said. His brother was about to destroy his career, his reputation, and his liberty. When an embezzler reported to the Law Society faces criminal prosecution, Gerald had every reason to wish Sir Edmund silenced, permanently. But you don't believe he did it? I know he did not. Gerald's boots are too large for the prints beneath the window. His midnight walk reached only the gate, and the method requires intimate knowledge of the household, the study, the habits, the firewood, the brandy, the window. Gerald has been estranged from Wexford Hall for years. His motive is a desperate man's, but the crime belongs to someone inside the house. We return to Wexford Hall. Holmes requested the household accounts ledger, and Lady Constance, composed, gracious, her grey eyes steady, produced it from the study desk without hesitation. You are thorough, Mr. Holmes. I admire thoroughness. I find it indispensable. He sat at the study desk and turned the pages with swift scanning attention. The ledger was meticulously kept, Lady Constance's handwriting small and regular, recording every expenditure. The sums were modest and orderly, but Holmes was looking at the pattern. Every month, withdrawals of between £15 and £20, listed under plausible headings. Sundry household expenses, linen replacement, repairs to east wing guttering. Each fell just below the threshold requiring Sir Edmund's counter-signature. Over 24 months, they totalled £392. Clever, Holmes murmured. Not greedy. Never enough to trigger scrutiny. Always attached to a credible purpose. A woman who understood the system and worked within its tolerances. He closed the ledger and turned to Lady Constance, who had remained in the doorway, watching. Lady Constance, I should like to examine your private correspondence. Letters received and sent over the past 3 months. For the first time, I saw something shift behind her eyes. Not panic, not fear, but a calculation, rapid and deep, like a card player weighing odds. Then it was gone, replaced by the same composed grace. Of course, Mr. Holmes, I have nothing to hide. She led us to her writing desk in the morning room and opened it. The desk was orderly. Stacked letters, a blotter, a pen tray, a small drawer of receipts and household papers. Holmes began with the letters, scanning each one briefly and setting it aside. To most were social correspondence, invitations, condolences, a letter from a dressmaker in London. Then he opened the small drawer. Among the receipts, a butcher's bill, a coal merchant's statement, a subscription renewal for a London magazine. He found it. A single sheet of paper, crumpled and smoothed flat, as though it had been discarded and then retrieved. A receipt from Henderson and Clark, spirits merchants, of 14 Jermyn Street, London. 1 case, Navy strength rum, 140 proof. Ordered 6 weeks prior to Sir Edmund's death. Shipped to Lambton Village Post Office. Billed to the account of Mrs. C. Harding. Holmes held it up. The room was very quiet. Mrs. C. Harding, he said. An interesting name. Constance Harding. The Christian name unchanged, the surname close enough to recall under pressure. A common technique for those unaccustomed to the use of aliases. They change as little as possible to reduce the risk of forgetting. Lady Constance stood perfectly still. The colour had not left her face. If anything, she had grown paler, a white so even and controlled that it seemed almost deliberate. That was a gift, she said, for a friend's husband, a naval officer. He had expressed a fondness for strong rum, and I thought, which friend? The pause was fractional. Mrs. Hargreaves, in London. Her husband's name and regiment? The pause was longer. I would need to check my... Lady Constance. Holmes's voice was quiet, almost gentle, but it carried the weight of a closing door. I have confirmed with the Lambton postmistress that a woman matching your description collected a parcel from Henderson and Clark 5 weeks before your husband's death. She signed for it as Mrs. Harding. The parcel weighed approximately 40 pounds, consistent with a case of bottled spirits. It was not fabric samples. Lady Constance said nothing. Her hands, which had been clasped at her waist, separated and fell to her sides. It was the smallest gesture, but it spoke volumes. A woman releasing something she had been holding. "You are very thorough, Mr. Holmes," she said again. But this time the admiration in her voice was gone, replaced by something flatter and colder, and I understood that we had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Holmes replaced the receipt in the drawer. He did not press further. He thanked Lady Constance for her cooperation, and we withdrew. In the corridor, he spoke low. The case is nearly complete. The will establishes motive with a deadline of January the 15th. The accounts show the diversion that triggered Sir Edmund's fury. The receipt proves Lady Constance obtained naval rum under a false name. The postmistress confirms collection. The decanter contains rum. The firewood was changed on her order. The tool was commissioned from Brennan on her instruction. The footprints lead from the kitchen door to the study window and back. He stopped walking. What remains is the tool itself, the finished instrument she used to unlatch that window. She buried it on the grounds, and I must find it. When I have it, Watson, I have everything. #Chapter 8. The buried tool. Holmes woke me before dawn. "Dress warmly, Watson. We are going to dig." I did not ask questions. The expression on his face, sharp, settled, final, told me that this was the day the case would close, one way or another. I pulled on my heaviest coat and boots, and we walked to Wexford Hall in the grey half-light before sunrise, our breath trailing behind us like smoke. The grounds were deserted. No light showed in the windows. The frost lay thick on every surface, the gravel, the yew hedge, the turned earth of the garden beds, and the silence was absolute, the deep silence of a January morning before the world has remembered to move. Holmes led me directly to the east side of the house, to the garden bed beneath the study window where we had found the footprints days before. He stood for a moment, while surveying the narrow strip of frozen earth between the stone wall and the yew hedge. "She stood here," he said quietly, "for over an hour, in the dark, in the cold, while her husband's life drained away on the other side of that glass. And when it was done, she had a tool in her hands that could connect her to the crime. She could not carry it back inside, too great a risk. She could not throw it into the fields. It might be found by a farm worker. She needed to dispose of it quickly, quietly, within reach." He crouched and began examining the frost crust with his fingertips, moving slowly along the garden bed. I watched him work, systematic, patient, testing the surface every few inches. The ground was iron-hard, the frost thick and undisturbed in most places. But Holmes was not looking for undisturbed ground. He found it 4 feet from the study window, close against the base of the wall. A patch where the frost crust was fractionally different, not smoother, but more uniform, as though broken and pressed flat again. The surrounding frost had the rough, crystalline texture of natural formation. This patch was denser, compacted. "Here," Holmes said. He produced a clasp knife and worked the frozen earth loose, cutting around the patch and prying the crust upward. The soil beneath came away in dark, cold clumps. Holmes dug with his hands, scraping carefully. 6 inches down, his hand struck iron. He brushed the soil away and lifted the object free. It was a narrow iron rod, approximately 14 inches long, with a right-angled bend at the tip. The tip had been filed to a smooth or narrow edge, thin enough to slide through a 1/4-inch gap, rigid enough to engage a horizontal latch bar, long enough to provide the leverage to turn it. The shaft was straight and well forged, the bend precise. Where the prototype in Brennan's workshop had been rough and experimental, this was the finished article, clean, purposeful, elegant in its simplicity. Holmes held it up in the pale morning light. Frost glittered on the iron. "The murder weapon," he said, though weapon is perhaps not the right word. There was no blow, no cut, no puncture. This tool opened a window. The cold did the rest. He stood and crossed to the study window. Without hesitation, he slid the narrow tip of the hook into the gap between the casement frame and the sill. The same gap where we had found the scratches. Now the iron disappeared into the narrow space. Holmes rotated the shaft carefully, feeling for the latch bar on the other side. I heard a faint metallic scrape, iron on iron, and then a soft click as the latch bar turned. The window swung open. Holmes pushed it wide, then pulled it shut and repeated the process in reverse, sliding the hook back through the gap, engaging the latch bar from outside, and rotating it to the locked position. The window was sealed. From inside, it would appear untouched, latched, secure, locked from within. The entire operation had taken less than 30 seconds. "That is how it was done," Holmes said. "That is how a woman committed murder in a locked room without ever entering it. She opened this window, let the January night pour in, waited for the cold to do its work, and then sealed the room again from outside. The door was bolted by Sir Edmund himself, alive and well, hours before. The window was relatched by his killer after he was dead. and the tool that made it possible was buried 6 inches beneath our feet. He wrapped the iron hook carefully in his handkerchief and placed it in his coat pocket. "Now," he said, and his voice carried something I rarely heard from Holmes, reluctance. "Now I must speak with Brennan." We found him at his cottage on the far edge of the estate, a small stone building with a slate roof and a vegetable garden, frost-bound and dormant. Smoke rose from the chimney. When Brennan opened the door, he took one look at Holmes's face and stepped back to let us in without a word. The cottage was spare and clean. A fire burned in the grate. At the kitchen table, a girl of perhaps 12 sat with a schoolbook open before her. Brennan's daughter, dark-haired, serious-eyed, watching us with the wary attention of a child who understands that something is wrong but not what. Brennan said something to her quietly, and she took her book and went into the back room, closing the door behind her. Holmes sat across the table from Brennan. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He laid out the evidence with the care of a man handling something fragile. "Mr. Brennan, 3 weeks before Sir Edmund's death, Lady Constance asked you to make a practice piece, an iron hook, as part of learning techniques for a decorative garden gate. You obliged." Brennan nodded slowly. 2 weeks before the death, she asked you to forge a refined version, a long-handled tool to reach a stuck attic window latch. You saw the practical logic and made it. "I did." That tool. Holmes reached into his coat and placed the iron hook on the table between them. Soil still clung to its surface. This tool was not used on the attic window. It was used on the study window. It was used to open the study casement from outside on the night of January the 12th, admitting freezing air into the room where Sir Edmund slept. And it was used to relatch the window from outside after he was dead. Brennan stared at the iron rod on the table. The blood left his face in stages, first the cheeks, then the lips, then even the weathered tan of his forehead, until he was grey as the winter sky outside his window. "No," he said. His voice was barely audible. "The iron filings in your workshop match the scratches on the study windowsill. The prototype on your shelf matches this tool's dimensions precisely. You made both." "She told me it was for the attic." The words came hollow, mechanical, as though he were reciting something from very far away. "The latch up there sticks in winter. I've told Mrs. Garrett about it a dozen times. It made sense. It made perfect sense." "I believe you," Holmes said. "You were deceived, Brennan. A deceived tool is not a guilty hand." But Brennan was not listening. He was staring at the iron hook, the thing his hands had made, the thing his skill had shaped. And I watched a man come apart from the inside. Not dramatically, not with shouts or violence, but with a slow, terrible collapse, like a wall losing its mortar stone by stone. "She stood there," he said, "in the garden, at the window, while he... Yes, and I gave her the means. You gave her a tool for a purpose she described plausibly. You had no reason to doubt her. I had every reason." Brennan's hands clenched on the table, the knuckles white, the scarred fingers rigid. "I knew her. I knew what she was. Not a killer, I don't mean that, but I knew she was cleverer than she let on. Cleverer than any of them. And I made her the key and never asked what door it opened." The backroom door was slightly ajar. I could see the girl's shadow on the wall, still, listening. Brennan saw it too. His face twisted, and he pressed his hand over his eyes. "Will I hang?" The question came raw and broken. Holmes answered immediately. "You will not. You were deceived, and I will make that plain. No court in England would convict a man for forging a tool whose purpose was misrepresented to him. You are a witness, Brennan, not an accomplice." Brennan lowered his hand. His eyes were red but dry, a man too proud or too stunned for tears. "What happens now?" "Now," Holmes said, "I speak with Lady Constance." He rose, and I followed. At the door, Holmes paused and turned back. "Brennan, whatever comes of this, whatever is decided, Lady Constance owes you a debt she can never fully repay. You and your daughter will not suffer for her crime. I will see to that." Brennan said nothing. He sat at his kitchen table with the iron hook before him, and when I looked back through the window as we crossed the yard, he had not moved. Holmes was silent on the walk back. He carried the iron hook like a burden rather than a trophy. And when he spoke, his voice was stripped of the satisfaction I had expected. "I have everything, Watson. Motive, method, means, opportunity, physical evidence. The case against Lady Constance is complete. Then it's over. The investigation is over. What remains is considerably more difficult." He looked at Wexford Hall. "Tomorrow evening, Watson, everyone in the drawing room, and I must lay it bare." Chapter 9. The Widow's Confession. Rain came that evening, the first thaw in weeks, turning the frost to grey slush and beating against the windows of Wexford Hall in fitful gusts. Holmes had sent word through Mrs. Garrett. All members of the household were to gather in the drawing room at 8 o'clock. The request carried no explanation, and none was needed. Everyone in that house knew what was coming. They were all there when Holmes and I entered. Lady Constance sat nearest the fire, hands folded, face composed. Gerald stood by the far window, arms crossed. Helena occupied the settee, pale and still. Brennan stood near the door, shoulders rigid. Mrs. Garrett sat upright in a straight-backed chair. Dr. Marsh had arrived last and taken a seat near the sideboard, as far from the centre of events as the room allowed. A fire burned in the grate. The rain struck the windows. The room was warm, but nobody seemed to feel it. Holmes stood before the fireplace. He did not sit. He looked at each of them in turn, a long, steady regard that lingered on every face. And then he began. 6 days ago, I was asked to investigate the death of Sir Edmund Hale. The coroner ruled cardiac failure. The evidence suggests otherwise. I believe Sir Edmund was murdered, and I am now in a position to explain how, by whom, and why. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Sir Edmund died of hypothermia. He froze to death in his own study on the night of January the 12th, in a room designed by its killer to become a lethal chamber. Holmes began the reconstruction. He spoke with measured precision, each sentence building on the last, like courses of brick. He described the green timber, unseasoned wood, ordered 3 weeks before the death, that would smoulder and die rather than burn. He described the flue, left fully open to draw cold air downward even as the fire failed. He described the brandy decanter, emptied of its contents and refilled with 140 proof naval rum, a spirit strong enough to render a habitual drinker profoundly unconscious rather than merely drowsy. Sir Edmund retired to his study at 7:30. He bolted the door. As was his custom, he poured his first glass from the decanter and began to read. By his third glass, he was deeply insensible. By 10 o'clock, the fire had died to ash. The room, stone walls, stone floor, vaulted ceiling, began to lose heat rapidly. He paused. The silence in the drawing room was total. At midnight, the killer left the house through the kitchen door, walked around the east side of the building to the study window, using a purpose-made iron tool. He reached into his coat and placed the hook on the mantelpiece, a soil still clinging to its shaft. She unlatched the casement window from outside and opened it wide. January air, well below freezing, flooded the room. She waited in the garden, in the shadow of the yew hedge, for approximately 90 minutes. Then she closed the window, relatched it from outside with the same tool, and returned to her bed. Holmes looked at the faces before him. Gerald had gone white. Helena's hand was pressed against her mouth. Brennan stared at the floor. Dr. Marsh was gripping the arm of his chair. Lady Constance had not moved. Sir Edmund never woke. His body surrendered its warmth through the night until his core temperature dropped to lethal levels. He died in his armchair without ever knowing what was happening to him. By morning, the room had warmed enough to seem merely cold. Doctor. Marsh examined the body for 10 minutes and signed a certificate of cardiac failure. The crime was designed to be invisible. It very nearly was. Holmes let the words settle. Then he turned to Gerald. Mr. Gerald Hale, you had strong reason to wish your brother dead. He had discovered your embezzlement and written to the Law Society. You were at the Crown and Thistle on the night of the murder, and you left at 10 o'clock, not returning until past midnight. Gerald opened his mouth, but Holmes raised his hand. You walked to the estate gate, stood in the dark, and turned back. Your boot prints approach the gate and retreat. They do not reach the study window. You had the motive of a thief, Mr. Hale, but not the method of this killer. You are cleared. Gerald gripped the windowsill as though the floor had shifted. Holmes turned to Helena. Miss Carey, you had clear motive and were present in the house. You claim to have remained in your room through the night. He paused. You did not. You left at 11 and did not return until 2. Your whereabouts are confirmed by an independent witness whose identity I'm not at liberty to disclose. You are cleared. Helena's eyes glistened. I saw her hands unclench, the slow release of a terror she had carried for days. Holmes turned to Dr. Marsh. Dr. Marsh, you owed Sir Edmund £300 and had been padding medical bills. A thorough investigation might have exposed your irregularities. You had every motive to avoid close examination of the body, and you obliged admirably. 10 minutes, a hasty certificate, case closed. Holmes's voice hardened. You did not kill Sir Edmund, but your negligence ensured his killer was not caught. Marsh said nothing. Holmes turned to Brennan. Mr. Brennan, you forged the iron tool that made this crime possible. You made it at the request of a woman you trusted, for a purpose she described plausibly, and you had no reason to suspect its true use. You were deceived. Your skill was exploited. The guilt is not yours. Brennan did not look up. His jaw worked once, twice, and then was still. Holmes turned to Lady Constance. The room seemed to contract around the two of them. The fire crackled. The rain beat against the glass. Every person in the room held their breath. Lady Constance, 6 weeks before your husband's death, you ordered a case of naval-strength rum from Henderson and Clark of Jermyn Street, under the name Mrs. C. Harding, and you collected it from Lambton Post Office under the same alias. You decanted the rum into your husband's brandy bottle on the evening of January the 12th. 3 weeks before his death, you ordered green, unseasoned firewood for the study, claiming Sir Edmund had complained of smoky fires, the opposite of the truth. 2 weeks before his death, you commissioned Thomas Brennan to forge a tool you described as a device for reaching a stuck attic window. You used it instead to open and relatch the study casement from outside. Your footprints, a woman's boot with a distinctive leftward heel wear, lead from the kitchen door to the study window and back. The household accounts show a pattern of small diversions totalling nearly £400. Your husband had discovered these diversions and instructed his solicitor to draft a new will, cutting you out entirely. That will was to be signed on January the 15th. He died on the 12th. Lady Constance looked at Holmes. Her face was pale but steady. Her grey eyes held his without flinching. You planned this crime with extraordinary care. You executed it alone. You weaponized the architecture of your own home, the stone walls, the failed fire, the open window, the January cold, and you turned them against a sleeping man who never knew he was dying. It is, I confess, one of the most meticulously conceived murders I have encountered. The silence lasted a long time. Rain hammered the windows, the fire spat. Then Lady Constance spoke. "Yes," she said. The word fell into the room like a stone into still water. Yes. All of it. Every detail exactly as you describe. She did not weep. She did not plead. She sat in her chair with her hands still folded and her back straight, and she told them the truth. My sister Nora is 23 years old. She is unmarried, and she is with child. The father is a man who promised her everything and gave her nothing, and left for Australia in September. My mother is 61 and ill, and has not left her bed since October. The money I took from the household accounts, every penny, went to Dublin to keep them alive, to pay for a doctor, to find somewhere safe for Nora to have her baby away from the eyes of people who would destroy her for it. Her voice was low and even. She addressed the room, but looked only at Holmes. Edmund found out about the money in November. He was not merely angry, he was contemptuous. But he called my family parasites. He said he would cut me off without a farthing and pursue an annulment. He said he would write to every family in the county and tell them about Nora. His word was, expose the disgrace. He wanted to ruin her, Mr. Holmes. Not because he cared about propriety, but because he could. Because it amused him to have power and to use it. She paused. When she continued, her voice did not waver. I had no money of my own. No property. No legal standing. Under the law, everything I had was his, including my right to remain in this house. If the new will was signed, I would have nothing. No income, no home, no means to care for my mother, or protect my sister. Nora would be exposed. My mother would die in a workhouse. And Edmund would sit in his study and drink his brandy and never think of us again. She looked down at her folded hands. I weighed his life against my sister's, against my mother's, against my own, and I chose. The room was silent. I could hear the rain, the fire, the ticking of the mantel clock. I could hear my own heartbeat. I am not asking for forgiveness, Lady Constance said. I do not expect it, and I am not certain I deserve it. I did what I did with open eyes and a clear mind. I planned it, I carried it out, and I would do it again. That is the truth, and you may do with it what you will. She fell silent. Gerald stared at her with an expression I could not read. Helena was weeping soundlessly. Mrs. Garrett's face was rigid. Brennan had not moved. Dr. Marsh looked as though he wished the floor would open beneath him. Holmes stood before the fireplace and said nothing. I'd seen him at the end of 100 cases, and I'd never seen that expression before, neither condemning nor absolving, neither satisfied nor troubled. The face of a man who had solved the puzzle and found that the solution was heavier than the mystery. Thank you, Lady Constance. That will be all for this evening. He took the iron hook from the mantelpiece, placed it in his coat, and walked out of the drawing-room. I followed him into the dark hallway where the rain was louder and the cold pressed in from every direction, and neither of us spoke for a very long time. Chapter 10. Justice and Mercy. I slept badly. The rain continued through the small hours, and every time I closed my eyes I saw Lady Constance's face, that steady composure, those grey eyes, now the quiet voice saying I weighed his life against my sister's, and I chose. Holmes, I suspect, did not sleep at all. When I came down at 7, he was seated by the fire with an empty coffee cup, and the expression of a man who has been arguing with himself for hours. I have made a decision, Watson, or rather, I have decided to let others make theirs. He did not elaborate. We walked to Wexford Hall in a grey morning that smelled of wet earth. The frost was retreating, water dripped from the eaves, the gravel was soft, and the rigid landscape had begun to loosen. It seemed wrong that the world should be warming on a morning like this. Holmes asked to see Lady Constance alone. Mrs. Garrett showed him to the morning room, and I waited in the hallway, close enough that I could hear the murmur of voices through the door, though not the words. The conversation lasted perhaps 20 minutes. When Holmes emerged, his expression gave nothing away. Lady Constance remained inside. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I gave her a choice. I told her that I could present my findings to the official police authorities, who would pursue prosecution to the full extent of the law, or I could present them privately to Gerald Hale, as next of kin, and allow him to decide whether the matter is pursued. The choice is hers." And she chose Gerald. I understood why. A public prosecution would mean a trial, a scandal, and the exposure of everything she had tried to protect. Nora's pregnancy, her mother's destitution, the family's disgrace. Gerald, whatever his failings, was at least a private audience. We found Gerald in the library, standing at the window with the look of a man who had not moved since the previous evening's revelations. He turned when we entered, and his face was haggard. Holmes closed the door. He did not sit. "Mr. Hale, your sister-in-law has confessed to the murder of your brother. The evidence is complete and conclusive. The question before you is what to do with it." Gerald stared at him. "What to do with it? You mean whether to go to the police?" "I mean precisely that. Lady Constance has asked that the decision rest with you. If you choose to pursue prosecution, I will support it with every piece of evidence I have gathered. If you choose otherwise, the death certificate will stand, and the matter will remain between those of us who were in the drawing room last night." Gerald's mouth opened and closed. He crossed the room, turned. He crossed it again. The conflict was written on him in every line, in the set of his jaw, the clench of his hands, the way his eyes moved without settling. "If she is prosecuted and convicted," he said slowly, "I inherit everything. The estate, the London property, the investments. Under the existing will, her share reverts to the estate, and as Edmund's only surviving blood relative." "That is correct." Gerald looked at Holmes. Something dark moved behind his eyes, not merely weak, but hungry. A man who had spent his life in his brother's shadow, and now saw a path into the light. All it required was the destruction of a woman who had killed to protect her family, while he had stolen to protect his vanity. Holmes let the silence work. Then he said quietly, "I should mention, Mr. Hale, that among Sir Edmund's papers I found his correspondence with the Law Society regarding your embezzlement. £2,200. The letter was dated January the 8th. The colour drained from Gerald's face. If Lady Constance is prosecuted, the investigation will be thorough. Sir Edmund's papers will be examined in their entirety. Every document, every letter, every record of every financial transaction connected to this household will become evidence in a murder trial, including, I expect, the letter to the Law Society." Gerald said nothing. He stood in the centre of the library with his hands at his sides, and the expression of a man who has reached for a prize and found a trap. "You face a choice, Mr. Hale. Pursue your brother's killer and inherit his estate. But in doing so, unexpose your own crimes to the light and face prosecution yourself, or let the matter rest, preserve your liberty, and live with the knowledge that your brother's death goes unanswered." Holmes paused. "I do not envy you the decision." Gerald was quiet for a long time. The rain had stopped. Through the library window, the first week's sunlight in days broke through the clouds and fell across the wet grounds of Wexford Hall. "I will not pursue it," he said. His voice was flat, exhausted. "The death certificate will stand." I could not tell, and I have wondered about it many times since, whether Gerald's decision was an act of unexpected mercy or an act of calculated self-preservation. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps, in the end, there is less distance between those two things than we like to believe. Holmes nodded. He had expected this, but he was not finished. "There are conditions, Mr. Hale, not negotiable." Gerald looked at him warily. "First, Lady Constance will ensure that her sister Nora receives proper care through the birth and beyond, funded from the estate. That is her affair. Second, Thomas Brennan and his daughter will remain in their cottage with permanent security of tenure. His position and salary will be maintained. He was used as an instrument without his knowledge, and the debt owed him is considerable. Fine. Third, Miss Helena Carey will be permitted to marry Captain Whitfield freely, and her trust administered fairly. She has suffered enough under Sir Edmund's control. Gerald's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Fourth, you will repay the £2,200 you embezzled. Sell the London flat. Borrow against your inheritance. But you will make it right, Mr. Hale, or I will make it right for you. Gerald flinched as though struck, but he met Holmes's gaze, and after a moment he said, Agreed. Holmes turned to leave. At the door he paused. One more thing. You asked me to come to Wexford Hall because you believed your brother was murdered. You were correct. But I think you also came to me because you hoped the investigation would remove Lady Constance and clear your path to the estate. In that you were disappointed. I suggest you use the disappointment wisely. He left Gerald standing alone in the library, and we walked out of Wexford Hall for the last time. The afternoon train from Lambton was nearly empty. Hampshire slid past the window. Wet fields, bare trees dripping, the frost retreating like a tide going out. Holmes sat opposite me with his eyes half closed, his fingers steepled. He had not spoken since we left the hall. I let the silence hold as long as I could. Then I asked the question, Was justice served, Holmes? He did not open his eyes immediately. When he did, they were thoughtful, not sharp, not piercing, but reflective, turned inward in a way I rarely saw. The law would say no. A woman killed her husband and will face no prosecution, no trial, no punishment. By every legal measure, justice has been denied. And by other measures, Watson, the question becomes considerably more complicated. Lady Constance Hale was trapped in a marriage she could not leave, under a husband who could destroy her family with a word, in a legal system that gave her no property, no standing, and no recourse. She had no right to her own income. She could not petition for divorce on any grounds a court would recognise. She could not protect her sister through any lawful channel. The law, which should have been her shield, was her prison. He was quiet for a moment. The train rocked gently on the rails. Does that excuse murder? No, I do not believe it does. She took a man's life, deliberately, methodically, with full knowledge of what she was doing. Sir Edmund Hale, for all his cruelty, did not deserve to die in a frozen room while the woman he trusted walked the garden outside. No argument of necessity erases that. Then what is the answer? Holmes almost smiled, a faint, melancholy expression that vanished as quickly as it appeared. The answer, Watson, is that there is no answer, not one that satisfies both the head and the heart. The law is blind to circumstances, and mercy is blind to principle, and somewhere between the two there is a space where imperfect people make imperfect choices, and the rest of us must decide how much weight to give them. He paused. I gave Lady Constance a choice. She gave Gerald a choice. Gerald chose his own liberty over his brother's justice, and I chose to let the living arrange their own accounts with the dead. Whether that was wisdom or weakness, I confess, I do not know. He fell silent. The train carried us through the gathering dusk toward London, the scattered lights of villages, the dark mass of woodland, the distant glow of the city rising on the horizon like a false dawn. I thought about Lady Constance in her drawing room, facing the years ahead with a dead man's blood on her conscience and a sister's life in her hands. I thought about Brennan at his kitchen table, staring at the iron tool his hands had made. I thought about Helena in the gamekeeper's lodge, holding onto a man she loved in defiance of everything that had tried to keep them apart. We arrived at Waterloo as the lamps were lit along the embankment. Mrs. Hudson had laid a fire in our rooms. Holmes hung up his coat, stood for a moment at the mantelpiece, then reached for his violin. He played for a long time, not the sharp improvisations of his agitated moods, but something slower, a melody that moved through minor keys with the patience of a river finding its way through stone. I sat by the fire with my notebook open but did not write. Some cases demand immediate recording, and this one needed time to settle, to find its shape, to become something I could set down without diminishing it. Outside, London hummed in the winter darkness. The fire crackled, Holmes played, and I sat with my empty page and thought about justice and mercy and the distance between them, and how a woman in a cold garden had stood in that distance and made her choice, and how none of us, not Holmes, not Gerald, not I, had found a better one.